I'm really happy to welcome Matthew Shipp to the Audio Garden to talk about his book, Black Mystery School Pianists and Other Writings, which is out on, I forget the name, Autono Media Press. And we're joined by Jay Rodriguez Sierra as well. How are you today, Matthew?
I'm very good. New York is beautiful weather today, so I'm soaking the weather in and trying to keep my head clear.
Really glad to have you here. I wanted to start out talking about the title of your book, which says a lot about what's in the book, Black Mystery School Pianists. I think it'd be enough to just talk about mystery school, but you talk about the Black Mystery School, and I'd like to know why you're that specific about it and give our audience a general idea about what that means, the mystery school pianist. And I think it's a term that you came up with to just describe something that you're thinking about in
Right.
your own work.
Well, I bandied that term around in interviews over the years and used it a few times. And Franco Terry, who runs USA Music Blogger, used to had read a couple interviews with me, and he had asked me to. He liked the idea. Now, the idea is basically that there is a branch in jazz piano history of a kind of alternative pianist, and I'll use the word alternative as a broad term, meaning that they're not really in the mainstream and they kind of have a sort of different approach to playing the instrument than
Mhm.
um, jazz pianists that might come from a more of a traditional classical background on the piano. Like Art Tatum might be the ultimate archetype of that, and Oscar Peterson after him. So the school, who I locate as the founding father in the school is Thelonious Monk, um, and
Mhm.
then there's a whole group of pianists that come after him that were inspired by his example, more by his example than by his actual sound world, and um, they kind of have a alternative touch, an alternative way of approaching the instrument, and an alternative language, which I get into in the essay. I know there's all very broad, and if somebody doesn't know exactly what I'm talking about, it might not make sense. But so I trace the whole lineage of that kind of school of thought within jazz piano, as opposed to say people that might come out of the Art Tatum to Oscar Peterson lineage, or out of the kind of lineage that is based on the pianists that played with Miles Davis, which would be like Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, or Keith Jarrett. There's kind of a through line of that too. So this people that come out of Thelonious Monk or his example, which is a very kind of classic school of pianists too. There's a whole kind of different way of thinking, a whole different way of posturing
Mhm.
yourself in that lineage. So that's the book. The essay explores that. Now it's not dogmatic either. I'm not saying that this is what I'm just saying. This is a way to look at it.
Right. And I think you talk about, wow, I'm hearing that feedback. Y- you talk about this sort of unifying thing, and yet I think you would say that what they have in common is that they don't actually sound alike. The
Well,
Black
yeah,
Mystery
that's a
School
big. I mean,
pianists,
it's not
that they each arrive at their own way of
Well,
right.
approaching.
Right.
it's
That's.
also like
I'm sorry.
I, 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 Matthew, I really love that what you just explained to us, and I've always felt that way. As you know, I'm a musician, and I've
Right.
studied a lot of piano, from Roland Hanna to Jackie Bayard and Hal Galper. Like I studied
Right.
piano because because it helped me to understand music, not just because I like to play the instrument. Because I'm not a piano player, but I play, and it's so important to understand that. And Jackie Bayard came into my mind as that, like, there's a lineage, there's a specific lineage that happened when Monk started playing that way, and of course there were others
Right.
who we didn't realize were already doing it.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm so glad that you pointed that out because it's beautiful coming from a piano player who understands that. and is able to complete. We have all these terms for things, and in the press it comes across all weird, because it's hard to explain. When you're speaking, you're talking about history, lineage, uh, geography.
Right.
Experience as a Black American, or influences from European aspects of people that we studied with, as well as the blues. And so it's interesting because it covers all of that.
Right.
So
Right.
that understanding of the mystery school is, I think it's a great term
Right.
because it's mysterious for a lot of people, you know. But
Mis-
when you explain it, it's not so, it's mysterious,
uh,
like, yeah, that was
um.
a mystery for me, knowing how I graduated out of kindergarten. That's a mystery for me.
Right.
But
Right.
you know what I'm saying?
Well, it's a mystery.
Like the mystery.
It's a mystery how we get up out of bed in the morning in this world.
Mm. Anyway, but that's beautiful. I just wanted to say that
Right.
and point that out, and we really appreciate you. It's great that I'm starting to work with Martha, and I really appreciate. I was like, man, this is great. You're inspiring others to want to write about their books and their philosophies and their sounds.
Right.
So
Right.
thank you.
Thank you. Um. Yeah. You said a lot there. So, uh, um.
Oh,
What I want to pick up on two things you said. I didn't include Jackie Byard in the mystery school for a few reasons. He's such a unique figure, and I can't really figure out
mm.
exactly what he is.
Yeah, I
He
know.
well, he
I
bridges
totally get it.
he bridges so many worlds. I did include Ram Blake in the essay, and
Yeah,
he's
Ram.
Caucasian, and I made a point that I'm
I
not
know Ram.
trying
I
to
know.
be
Yeah.
ethnocentric in this, but Jackie
Yeah.
Byard had a very close relationship with Ram Blake. In fact, they actually did a duo album
Yes.
together. You
Mm.
also mentioned Hal Galper, uh, who has
Yeah.
done a lot of research into like how the brain processes information and how improvisation is a nervous system type of thing. And I deal with
Right.
that
He's
in the
yeah.
book a lot in different essays.
I know. I noticed that.
Right,
Mm. Anyway,
right,
it was just these are the names because those are the people I studied with or people that I associated myself, with as a horn player.
right, right.
So anyway, I love piano. So I am, I love playing piano. All of, but anyway, so I loved your playing and all of that. I saw you at the Eric Dolphy
Oh,
thing
right,
where
right,
I
right.
met you
Oh,
backstage
wow.
with
Oh,
Verona
right,
Clough,
right. We
and
talked. That's right.
we
Okay.
talked
I
last
was trying to
backstage,
remember
right?
where I knew you from.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's right.
And
Right, right. You know William
and I'm
Parker.
playing
Yeah,
with
yeah. All right, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And William Parker and
Right,
stuff.
right.
And Verona Clough. I'm playing with Verona Clough and a colleague of yours, Sumi Tonuka.
Sumi Tanaka.
Sumi yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Who
So I'm
studied
playing with her.
who studied with Dennis Sandoli was my teacher, who I have a chapter
Right,
on in the book
exactly.
about.
Yes, I love it. So I thought that was a
Right,
beautiful connection because I just rehearsed for it the other day,
right,
and then when I read what you wrote about him, it made me totally. I met him one time with Gunter Hampel many years ago,
right,
and Gene Lee. I was a kid.
right,
I just you don't understand all the implications of the amazing
right, right.
artist. But anyway, it's so beautiful to hear. You covered a lot of ground in that book, and it's really inspiring. So I'll be quiet, and we want to listen to you. So
Oh,
go ahead. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, you dedicated your book to three poets, and I find that interesting. I think poetry is a mystical language,
Right,
mystery school language in itself. If you look at it in the breadth of literature, I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding poetry. And whether it's improvised spoken word or the written word, sometimes poets can't even explain what they've written. Um, how is that related, do you think? I mean, why did you dedicate it to three poets, and what is that really saying about Mystery School of Piano?
well, the mystery school essay is the major essay in the book. I mean, the dedication, first of all, the three poets, John Ferris, Steve Delachinsky, and Lester Affleck, who are all deceased, they were like three of my closest friends, maybe my closest friends, all three
Mm,
of them. Um,
mm, mm, mm.
John Ferris, who I assume you knew,
Yes.
uh, he was a
I knew him from being around Gathering of the Tribes. He was also close friends with Steve
right, right,
Cannon, who I worked
Mm.
closely with, and there was a whole group of those poets who would sit around and talk about stuff like this, like the zero lecture in your
right,
book, and what it means to
Mm.
improvise, where all this comes
Mm.
from.
right. Um, John Ferris, who was a cantankerous old, could be very nasty sometimes, but he was
Yes, yes.
uh, one of my closest friends. I mean, I dedicated it to them because they have, I've been around them for decades, and
Mm,
we all share kind of a very similar um, aspirations, even though they're in different mediums. And they understood me, and I understand them. And they were a big part of my creative life, all three of them, and my social life also. And that was one. That's one great thing about New York, and especially in the '80s, is the fusion between like your artistic life, your social life, your private life. I mean, at one time, um, the concert halls, the dance halls, the galleries. There was a fusion of culture. You would just go out at night and kind of music, poetry, um, painting. It was just all fused, and it was all fused in a social scene too. I guess the best known example of all of that is Jean Michel Basquiat. Because he's a painter, he's hanging out in nightclubs, he's
mm,
just friends with a lot of people in various mediums, but it was a very alive kind of social matrix back then, and I was around all that and part of it. And these poets were that I dedicate the book, were also around. Now, Steve Delachinsky is kind of known as a jazz poet. I mean, that's not the right denotation for him,
mm,
but he was out at concerts every night. He did like kind of live action paintings or
Right.
poetry at concerts, and he's known in this scene, and he was a very close friend of mine.
mm.
Lester Affleck is kind of a different animal of a different type, but did you know Lester?
I did not know Lester. I knew Steve and John.
Right. And you knew
Yeah.
Steve Delachinsky, I'm sure.
Yes.
So the
Yes,
dedic
and I think it's interesting, he was known as a jazz poet, but I would not have described his poetry that way. I think he was very dedicated and knowledgeable about the music.
right,
And so I think his moniker as a jazz poet came from him writing a lot about the subject.
right,
But you talk about the concept of jazz, and in some ways you seem to want to discard it, and yet you also point to this lineage of jazz pianists who I think would all fit into that category from a intellectual scholarly point of view of being
right,
jazz pianists, and as you point out, black jazz pianists, except for one of them. So I found it very interesting, your idea about how you fit into that as an improviser and how you're partly defined by it and yet completely not defined by that concept.
right. Well, life is full of paradox. I think that's what gives anything its juice is paradox, and
Mhm,
I think we're confronted with paradox all the time. So
mhm,
yes, I mean, I kind of became who I am out of a very specific lineage. But I'm also always looking for the crack in it, not in it because it is what it is, but I think you can be. I mean, okay, we all come from our parents, but yet we all have distinct personalities and existences that are not our parents. So, um, I'm while you might be birthed by something, it takes on a whole different aspect when it is you and you are trying to become that meta thing of sorts that is not exactly who your parents were. So I think there's a search for that in the book. I'm looking, hoping that like I don't get narrowly defined by whatever I come out of or come out of. Um, but at the same time, I have utter respect for the forces that made me who I am, or that birthed the possibility of me becoming who I am.
mm. Very good.
And I think part of that is being an improviser. That seems more important in a way than being a jazz musician necessarily.
Right,
And I found it interesting you have a lecture that you call the Zero Lecture. And I'm paraphrasing, but you say that if you could find a way to not play the piano, that you would live in that silence and share that. That seems to me sort of a nutshell of what the Black Mystery School of Pianists
Mm.
is.
Right. Well, I mean, it's everything is mind anyway. I mean, like a
Right.
piano is
I
an
thought.
instrument, but that somebody had
Hmm.
to conceive it. So
Yeah. I
I
also.
yeah, I think you can melt
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
everything down to kind of its kind of spirit. I mean, I don't mean to sound like a Platonist, but but
Mm.
down to its spiritual kind of archetype, and at that point, it is all silence. It is all this. I mean, as
Yeah.
T.S. Eliot, the still point, the turning world. Um, so yeah, if I mean, I read a quote by somebody that once I don't remember who the quote was, but they were saying any author's idea are basically like could be fit into one sentence, but their whole career is learning how to make that one idea a million, disguise it a million different ways. Um, so if that's true, which you know, the essence of any musician is a vibration, and that vibration is not in space time. It's just so it sits in a pool of silence. So in its pure form, you can radiate that silence, and that is the music. But of
Right.
course, since we're in space time and had to fill our day, like if nobody's going to buy a CD of a dimensionless point of silence, so you had to it has to unfold within the
Somebody
45
will sell
minutes of
it though.
music.
Let's work on that, Matthew. You and I, man.
Yeah,
And we'll make $1 million. No, I was. It made me really think a lot about. It's great that Martha's saying this and asking those questions and these terminologies because we're using words in poetry and words are powerful, so things like the word jazz are specific things. Some of us don't want to use the word jazz because it's derogatory to the school of thought, because
right,
I think that your stuff is your school of thought is wider than what, not that, than that, and the idea of improvisation is actually a very classical thing. It could be a classical,
right,
and not everything that's improvised is jazz,
right,
right? And so, and that's another. So there's always this kind of like educate. Like I feel like we have to. Like I felt that in what you're saying is that also that there's an education in the understanding that of what it is and what it isn't. And the truth is, there's a nothingness that's very open that people have to accept before they are able to embrace uh, the whole thing, as far as music
right,
and let alone jazz,
right,
which is, the Black American, or what we don't have a better term for it. But like Gary Bartz keeps on saying, he goes, we're composing, and that's the truth. We're composing in real time,
right,
and he feels like that's a better for him, because it's always trying. At least for me, my own journey has been trying to kind of, yes, it's part of that, but and and understanding that people know that the music is bigger than us, and in the same with words. So words are so important, uh as to how they implicate or people not that you have to worry about what other people are thinking, but that you want to be able to express it so that they understand that it's a very open place,
right.
so that nothingness is a I get that. It's
Yeah,
very, it's heavy, it's
yeah.
beyond that.
Nothingness
Yeah.
is a deep concept, but it's everything.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Anyway, so I was just thinking about that, about the word jazz. You got Nicholas Payton, who's like, bam, Black American music. Everybody's got like a thing. So I was really,
right,
it's really refreshing to hear you be very open and very clear
right. By the way,
about, yeah. And I really appreciate that. I
since you
really
mentioned
appreciate, I think,
since you mentioned Nicholas, I don't know if you're
my
familiar,
man.
but in the last couple of days, he's in. There's a new.
I know,
Okay, okay. There's a new
I know, I
controversy.
Well,
know, I know, Nick, I
I
know.
don't. So go ahead and finish what you were going to
Oh
say
no.
about him, please, Matthew.
Well,
I don't know about what you're talking about with Nicholas
oh, never,
Payton,
never.
so
I
please
don't want to go.
share it with us.
No, there's
Now
just
we're not.
there's a new controversy of something he
It's
said.
what you think. Don't worry. You and
Okay.
I.
It has
Yeah,
nothing to
it's
do
cool.
with
That.
this. What we're talking
Yeah.
about.
Well,
Okay.
you know how it is when you read poets. Anyway, that's poetry in itself.
Right,
But the whole point of nothingness is important.
right,
Like that, I was talking to Martha earlier about struggling with silence. Like like I had to like reset, and
right,
I'm sure. Anyway, but that's a whole thing. But I like the way we're talking about your book and how that plays into it. And I'm seeing. I love the questions that the Martha's asking because it's making me think deeply about all these things
Right,
and how you, because I love your playing and your expansiveness, and I know I hear classical, I hear all of these things, and I loved it when like the Wayne Shorter Quartet when they played freely. I remember with the Danilo Perez, some of these guys were afraid to play quote unquote free because they thought free meant not educated or
right,
unorthodox, or you know what I'm saying. There's that's part of the lineage between the bop thing and that happens. Unfortunately, it's not that it has to be that way, but I think that's why it's so important that you talked about the mystery schools and who fits in and doesn't, and it's beyond the music.
right, right.
It's your
Well,
personal expression with words, and the fact that you put poets in there because there's a specific uh lineage to both that are related, and it was your human experience, which I love.
right. Well, I
So
think
yeah.
what I'm really trying to get at in the book is that language is. I think it can be, and this is throughout all the essays in different ways, and that anything can. I mean the planet Earth can be looked at as a language. Anything can be looked at as a language,
Mm,
and so therefore, um, whether it's spoken word or whether it's music or whether it's your body and working out, I'm always trying to get to the genesis of
mm,
what generates the structure, because once you get
mm,
to the genesis, to that, whether it's a dimensionless point, whether it's truly nothingness, or whether you think of it in a field effect in physics, like a generating a field that generates a whole structure. um, Once you get to that, then everything can be melded down into a singularity, and
mm,
it's pure language, and so therefore it's pure vibration. And at that point, if you understand it at its genesis, politics enters later when it actually becomes a more, and I don't want to use the word complex because nothingness is as complex as a million things, maybe more complex actually.
mm,
But when you get to the genesis of anything, you really see how everything's interrelated, everything is connected, and it just gives you an understanding and an ability to escape your prejudices towards things, given
mm.
that we all have a common origin, or all language possibly has a common origin, and I'm always trying to get to the some understanding of that.
You refer to the Tower of Babel in your book and that time, like prehistoric time, when we might have all been speaking just one language. Um, and so you have these different meditations that we've kind of circled around in this conversation. And the book is a combination of sort of your opening essay of defining the Black Mystery School of pianists. And but I would say it includes some poetry, and there's also some really great photographs in here of you and Sun Ra and some of the other greats. But I wonder if you could take a moment to actually, it's a short list. If you could give us the list of people who you defined as the Black Mystery School
um,
of
well,
pianists.
I locate Thelonious Monk as the founding father. Herbie
Hmm.
Nichols was actually a contemporary of Monk. He actually was a writer also. He wrote I think, some of the first essays about Monk, but he's truly a great pianist and a conceptualist and an iconoclast of his own, Herbie Nichols. And then from there, I branch out into three pianists that were contemporary age wise, but they're completely different: Mal Waldron, Randy Weston, and Cecil Taylor. Um, and I talk about how Monk's vision um, embodied it allowed reactions of all three of them that are they're so different, but yet they kind of come out of the same matrix of influences, sort of. Um, I talk about Duke Ellington mainly because he was a big influence on Monk, but I don't include him in the school because the school has kind of a posture to it, and the posture usually is kind of against easy or the search for acceptance in a certain strata of society is kind of a more underground thing, and Duke Ellington was not operating in that headspace, even though his piano playing
Right.
was very deep and very kind of in some ways non-mainstream. Um, but he was a big influence on Monk. But I don't include him in the school, but I talk about him for that reason. After Mal Waldron, Randy Weston, and Cecil Taylor, I talk about a figure who's very unknown. Hassan, the legendary Hassan ibn Ali was his real name. They're just starting to release recordings of his right now. For years, there was only one record out because he never really he had some problems and basically stayed in his parents' house and never really performed a lot. Um, but he's to me one of the purest examples of that school exist. And then I go into Andrew Hill a lot, who is a very pure example of this school also. And from there, I branch out a little into Sun Ra and Horace Tapscott. So that's the major figures of the school. I mean, I talk about a lot of other pianists, like any category. There's people that go in and out of it. I look at these people as kind of platonic archetypes within the school, and there's many people that go in and out of it that I'm not sure um, that sort of could be defined in within the parameters of the school at times. But they're the major figures that I locate within the nexus of this nomenclature.
And you also talk about John Coltrane quite a bit, although he's not a pianist. It
Right.
seems that you certainly bring him into this school of thought.
Well, he comes in the zero lecture a lot because in this, I mean, I consider myself a mystic. Whatever. Whether somebody thinks I'm full of it, yeah, they can. But and I there's certain figures in jazz history that actually really attempted to um, synthesize mysticism with the idea of jazz language. And John Coltrane is obviously one of the big exponents of that. His wife Alice um,
Mm.
is to me, I consider her the archetype of what I call the cosmic pianist, which I didn't write about in this book. That's a whole different
I don't know how many times I listened to Journey to
right. Oh, I
Satchidananda.
mean, yeah,
I couldn't even count.
she's a visionary beyond the realm of visionaries. But Sun Ra was another exponent of this synthesis of mysticism in jazz. I talk about Coltrane in the Zero Lecture a lot, in the example you brought up of the Tower of Babel, because I talked about him almost trying to get by brute force past the sound barrier to try to get to that original language. If there was one language on the earth, using music as a tool to try to get to that kind of vibration. And I mean, I talk about it metaphorically, not literally, but
Hmm.
I talk about Coltrane in that realm. And then there's another poem which is under the name The Tour Diary, where I talk about when I was a teenager, I would be listening to Coltrane. Sometimes I would fall asleep and I would actually hear the solos he's doing as actual language. I mean, people say music is a language, but I would actually hear his solos talking to me. And I talked about that in this one prose poem. So, yeah, yes, Coltrane comes in and out of is weaved in and out of the book in the exploration of what is music? Is music a language? What it means for music to be a language? If music is a language, how does it relate to like spoken word? Given that in Africa you actually have a quote talking drum, so in the continuum of African and trans African as an American Black, what it means to have that in your DNA, and Coltrane as an example of all this. I mean, Coltrane grew up in the Black Christian church, which has a tradition, especially in the Pentecostal aspect of it, of speaking in tongues and that whole idea of giving yourself over to the universal language. Because when you're speaking in tongues, that's what happened to the apostles in the book of Acts in the Bible. in Pentecost, when after Christ died, when they were in this room and the Holy Spirit descended, and they went out and they spoke to the people, and everybody in the square understood what they were saying. So it was back to the pre-Babel, Tower of Babel original language.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're coming from a Black Christian tradition, and especially if it's Pentecostal based, the whole idea of speaking in tongues and is there. I mean, that's, you're speaking in languages you don't understand, but everybody else on some level understands it, and it is that traditional, that pre-Babel language of sorts. I mean, in the New Testament, there's a tie to everything in the Old Testament. On some level, it's a remake of the poetic metaphors. Um, Pentecost and pre-Babel is a connected symbol, and so in the sense of culture, you have somebody coming from a Black Christian tradition, but they get into kind of Eastern mysticism, and especially universal consciousness with a Hindu base, which is what Alice Coltrane is, because she became an actual Hindu. Um, Coltrane never became anything, but he trafficked in those ideas, and so yeah, he's presented in the book as a major figure in trying to synthesize mysticism with the whole idea of jazz actually being a language that's generated by our psyche for some reason.
And I guess I'm going to draw attention to the cover of your book at this point because you obviously, very cute, were also come from that Black Christian
But well,
American
I was an older
history.
boy. I'm 5 years older than the picture. That was I was actually grew up Episcopalian. Which there's a Black Episcopalian tradition, but it also is really actually related to the Church of England very much. So I
Right.
but my grandparents, my parents were Episcopalian, but my grandparents were actually AME on one side and Baptist on the other side. So I was around kind of a very um Protestant, not in the Black Protestant sense, but like in the background, but also around like Black Christian. I was around both of it a lot as a kid. So I had a very interesting upbringing, to say the least.
Well, this time goes by so quickly in the audio garden. Jay, did you have one last question for Matthew before we ask him maybe to read a little bit from the book?
No, I just, it was really, it's great to be able to hear this aspect of artists expressing themselves in words and philosophical things. I think more artists like myself and others have to put those things together earlier in their lives,
Right,
and put their thoughts on paper for people to read them in words so that they understand that when they're hearing on one note, when they're hearing notes, there's a whole life and philosophy and light that as human beings relates to them whether they play music or not. And
right.
so it's such a beautiful message. So thank you, Matthew.
Thank
I
you.
just wanted to comment here and compliment you on that.
Right.
And that's it. And I hope to play sometime.
Yeah, yeah. I'm around.
Yeah,
Could I say one
beautiful,
thing?
but I yes, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say that there's a chapter in the book. It's not going to one I'm going to read, but there's a chapter in the book on the '80s in New York, and that whole sensibility that I talk about is a big thing to me. The club life in the New York in the '80s, the mixture of races, that how that happened here in New York,
That's right.
the mixture of 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 heterosexual culture with gay culture, how everything was in a melting pot in a beautiful way, and that was a
Yeah,
big part of my development, and that's a really important
Mm.
chapter to me in the book. And that,
I can relate to that.
right,
I would have to echo that myself. I graduated in 1980 and went from uptown to downtown
right,
East Village, and it was just like a whole revolution in my
yeah,
mind
exactly,
that took
right.
place.
Did you hang out?
Interesting.
Did you hang out at the pyramid?
I did
I did.
not.
I did.
Oh, you did. I was
I
there.
did
I know
not,
because
but
I was at the pyramid every night at one point in my life.
Wow,
And,
that's when I used to live up the block. I lived in the Lower. I grew up in the Lower East Side,
oh, cool.
and
I
East
was never
Village.
much of a drinker,
Mm.
but I guess I want to mention briefly that you do talk about, you know, the whole drug scene as well and how you sort of managed to
Well, that
avoid
Brandy's.
some of the
that
pitfalls of
that's the
that,
chapter
which
I
I
was
found rather
that's the chapter I
interesting.
was going to read.
Okay,
All
great.
right, well,
Then
that's the
why
whole
don't you go
scene.
ahead and dip into
Yeah,
that
yeah,
for
Okay.
us,
yeah.
please?
Matthew and I are gonna have our own session sometime to talk because we have so much in common growing up here.
Yes, we do. I'm
Yeah.
sure we do.
All right. Thank you so much. Go
Thank
ahead.
you.
I'm sorry, sir.
This chapter is called "The Wire Epiphanies." Now, The Wire is a magazine, a music magazine out of England and the UK, and they asked me to write this column. They have a column called Epiphanies, where different musician writes every month. So I wrote this essay both on um, heroin and William Parker, who's a great bass player I play with a lot, who's a very clean living person. So here we go. I moved to New York in the early 1980s to be in the matrix where a lot of activity in the jazz that I loved happened. I had an insatiable appetite to experience what any young artist's life would entail, and with a complete open mindedness. I had strong underlying principles for someone in their early 20s, but I was open to whatever. From the first day I started meeting musicians I idolized, many of whose recordings I devoured as a teen, it was amazing to me how many of the older musicians embraced me, encouraged me, and seemed to accept me right away, as if there was some bond that already existed and that they recognized. In the circle of older musicians, there was a common theme: heroin. I became very close with an older musician and an icon, one of the sweetest persons I have ever known, but whose apartment, which I spent a lot of time in, functioned as a shooting gallery for addicts. I saw a steady parade of musicians in various stages of shooting up and using. They all took a fatherly and protective attitude towards me, saying things like, "You see what I'm doing? Don't you ever do this." They begged me to never emulate them. It was actually kind of sweet, but I was seeing idols of mine engaging in this activity on a daily basis. These guys all had something or some spirit that I aspire to, but what to make of this excess? To complicate matters, my social life with peers in my own age bracket outside of my life as a jazz musician was as a club kid in an 80s New York club scene. Think of some of the places that John Michel Basquiat was hanging out. I was a dancer and a hanger oner and loved the culture that was being created around 80s freestyle music, early hip hop with splashes of European synth pop and remnants of no wave. I was a nightly at the Pyramid Club and also did my time at the World, Dance Interior, and more. Heroin was rampant on this scene also. Meanwhile, I was devouring writings by William Burroughs, who might be one of the few artists whose addiction actually feeds into their art in a way that makes his body of work unimaginable without it. The epiphany came through meeting William Parker and developing a close friendship with him. He embodied every aspect of the mystic qualities of the jazzman, someone who rejected the easy solutions that society has to offer and truly believed in the revolutionary possibilities of the language we wrongly use the term free jazz to denote. Here was someone who, like Burroughs, sees discursive language as a virus that invaded the nervous system and as an arbitrary construct. But Parker believes in the language that he is articulating on his musical instrument as a way to bypass all this and to get to the silence he calls the world of vibrations, the tone world. But there is no injecting of chemicals into the body in this vision. William had bypassed the self destructive aspects while maintaining the mystique. Not only has he not used narcotics outside of prescription medicines, he has never even had a drink of alcohol. By the way, even though I stayed away from narcotics, I was an alcoholic for many years, but I have not had a drink since 1999. I am headstrong and focused and think that even had I never been around William, I would have stayed away from the drugs. But who knows? He is a towering example of integrity, life wise and artistically. But to add to that, he does not have an ounce of judgmental attitude to people who have chosen a different path and who indulge their demons. I guess the epiphany for a young Matthew Shipp was that all the excess that exists around the arts is exactly that, excess. One can stand for the purity of an idea in an unpretentious way and not be self-destructive. William Parker was that. If drugs enter the equation, that is a choice. Some of my favorite musicians and closest friends went down this path. Regardless, I love them as much as you can love anyone. This might be obvious to most readers, but if one person who needs to hear this does so, then good. The drugs are not necessary for anything. Thank you, William Parker, for your towering integrity, for showing that there is a way to bypass the silliness of society, to be an outlaw of sorts without being strung out on junk.
Very interesting. Thank
That's
you for
beautiful,
that,
man.
Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, man.